Hello YouTube. I often bring you information from very remote areas of Russia and the former Soviet Union because sightings and encounters that take place in those parts of Russia are very important, and it shows you that the United States, for example, is not the main area of UFO encounters and visitations. And that's important to know. One of the most interesting areas is the territory of the Russian Far East. I was especially interested in the area called Urkan, which is in itself an anomalous site in the area of the river Urkan between Tinda and Zeya. And that's important because China is not too far away from there. In the early 1970s, Soviet Air Force had somewhat fruitlessly searched there for the UFO landing sites. And in the spring of 1970, the Soviets observed frequent UFO flights, not long after the relations between the USSR and China were dangerously strained. And basically there was warfare over the possession of the Damansky Island. UFO appearances were in detail recorded by both sides. When the UFOs appeared over Mongolia too, which is not too far away from there, Mongolian border guards tried to shoot them down, but failed. And it was the Mongolians who publicly revealed UFO presence in the area. According to them, UFO flight routes were over the Soviet territory, approximately 1,660 kilometers to the northeast from Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. Soviet radar operators were able to pinpoint the area more precisely, but all attempts to locate the UFOs ended in failure. The only thing the Soviets were able to establish was that the UFOs appeared and then disappeared over the same territory of the remote Siberian taiga, not far from Urkan. So it's a very interesting area. But as years go by, it's becoming even more interesting. Because in the 1970s, in that area, according to some reports, a disc-like object was found, and it resembled the top of the mushroom in itself. And the diameter was about 6 meters, it was 3 meters high, and it weighed 720 kilograms. Apparently, whatever was found was taken to the territory called Tinda, and from there to Novosibirsk, where it was hidden or concealed in the area of the Akademgorodok, which is the top science city was in the Soviet Union, to the east of the Obskaya More station. I cannot verify anything more about the so-called discovery, but things are happening in that part of Russia. And if you recall from my lecture, the year of 1982 is very memorable in the history of the Soviet Union, UFOs and USOs. A lot of sightings, a lot of dramatic encounters, including those humanoid swimmers I mentioned in my other videos, and a few other incidents. Well, in August of 1982, not far away from the settlement called Magdagachi, and that's 150 kilometers to the northeast from Urkan, two people were driving late at night in the forested area, and then they observed, and that's in the taiga, the dense forest region, they observed very bright light, and an object that looked like a headlight was rising through the air. A little bit later, it turned into the so-called tail of ray tail. That's what it looked like, and then it became bigger, grew in size, and turned into the radiant sphere. And that sphere, that UFO, flew towards the Magdagachi settlement, and it grew more and more in size. So the two people who were riding motorcycles chased it. And at that time, population that lived in the settlement, they came out and observed gigantic sphere-like UFO. The dogs were howling and making horrible noises, and that sphere remained over the settlement until 4 o'clock in the morning, and then it just flew away and dissipated in the sky. There were no lightnings, the weather was dry, and the observation was well taken. But in 2007, not far away from the area, over the Amur River in Blagoveshchensk, again there were UFOs sighted. They were oval, they were radiant, they moved chaotically, they would appear or disappear in an instant. And it was something that quite many people saw, and they were alarmed because UFOs do create panic among population that is not used to them. So Russian journalists decided to visit the area and to speak to the police and the FSB, which is the secret police in Russia today. And they didn't get any information from the border guards, and the FSB would not speak to them, but they did speak to the local police, which had more information, and then they got in touch with the Russian organization called Kosmopoisk, and its leader. He passed away last year, but he was very active in the research of the UFO phenomena and paranormal in the Soviet Union and Russia. His name was Vadim Chernobrov, and they were able to give some examples of what was taking place in the Blagoveshchensk and Amur River areas. For example, on October 31st of 1967, the crew of the passenger airplane Il-14 were flying the airplane between the Khabarovsk-Blagoveshchensk route, and about 160 kilometers from the Arkhari settlement, the crew observed a yellowish-red object which looked to be like moon, but it wasn't the disk, it was more like the partial moon. So the head, the commander of the airplane got in touch with the ground control and wanted to find out if they observe anything, but as usually happens, the ground control said no, we don't see anything else. But the object was changing shape. It was becoming light blue like the burning gas. Then it became 3 times the size of the moon and disappeared. But there was another airplane in the area, Il-18, which they told the ground crew that they observed something similar. It was a very interesting case, and people talked about it quietly because it was forbidden to speak about UFOs too much in the Soviet Union at the time. And the years later, when the Russian journalists came to talk to the local airport personnel, they were told that, yeah, we see quite a lot of such incidents, but we don't want to talk about them because we don't want to be sent to a doctor. But there were other cases, interesting cases. In February of 2001, for example, a giant silvery sphere with flames coming out of it. It was recorded, I should say, over the local church. And it was flying noiselessly. It was making strange movements, and it was observed for about 18 seconds, and then it just disappeared over the river. In 2015, I should mention, there was another incident which was recorded by camera about a gigantic in size flying saucer which was over the city of Blagoveshchensk about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The object, this UFO, was hovering at the altitude of several kilometers, and it was absolutely noiseless, according to the observer. What's interesting now is that we need to remember that not far from that area is the Vostochny Cosmodrome, or the Spaceport, which is the newest Russian spaceport under construction at the time in the Amur Oblast in the Russian Far East. And the Vostochny Cosmodrome was created so that Russia could reduce its dependency on the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. What's interesting is that when the first rocket Soyuz 2 was launched from the Vostochny spaceport, you could see a UFO in that photograph. It was accompanying the rocket launch, which is in itself not unusual. And I mentioned in my lectures and my videos that similar incidents took place all over the Soviet Union when space missions were launched. So this was very interesting. I think it was a failure in April of 2016 when the rocket was launched, and of course some people try to blame the UFO, as is often the case. They get blamed for things like that. So this was very interesting. But also in the January of 2017, somebody filmed using the cell phone another object, and this was in the Chigiri area of the Amur region. The young people observed strange object, UFOs, that flew towards China, and just 200 kilometers from that village of Chigiri is the Russian spaceport Vostochny. People who investigated this case, and journalists, they found out that at that time there were no launches from Vostochny whatsoever. And before we leave, I do want to talk about Mongolia, which is not that far away from the area, but it's a very interesting territory when it comes to UFOs, and very few people know what had been taking place there before. There was a very interesting book published in the United States in 1992 through the efforts of Dr. Haynes. It was Felix Ziegel's Top Soviet Ufology. The book was called UFO Landings in the USSR and Other Countries. It was volume 5, dated 1979. There is a very interesting entry about Mongolia. Back in 1951, a Soviet veterinarian stationed there witnessed a UFO landing in the Gobi Altai Almak area. One evening about 7 o'clock, he and his companion observed blinding flash on a mountain slope. At a distance of 1.5 kilometers, they saw an object which was shaped like a mushroom cap of approximately 100 meters in diameter. There were humanoid beings moving up and down from the object to the ground. It appeared that instead of eyes and stomachs, the beings had light projectors. Both eyewitnesses decided to approach the object, but could not go through a force field about 500 meters just before the site. About 20 minutes later, the UFO flashed and departed. The landing site contained scorched ground of 30 meters in diameter. This was the very site where some years later a rich uranium ore was discovered. You remember how they described it? It was shaped as a mushroom cap, that UFO of 1951. Well, the case that I told you about 1982, not far from Urkan, that's how the UFO, which was allegedly recovered, that's how it was described. So keep your eyes and ears glued, I should say, to Eurasia, to Siberia and the Far East, because a lot of interesting things take place there. And in the future, I'll also speak about recent archaeological discoveries in the area not far away from Blagoveshchensk and Urkan that lead one to believe that ancient civilizations, advanced civilizations lived or existed in that area of modern Russia. Thank you.